Okay, well, welcome. Good morning. I have to say, this is one of the best sellouts we've had for a while, and also for it to be 10 a.m. on a Friday morning, 10, 12 days before Christmas. Impressive. Thank you. Of course, it's justified because of our star speakers today. I'll introduce them in a second, but first I should probably introduce where we are, and indeed myself. So this is the Danube Institute, as most of you will know. I'm Callum Nicholson, Director of Research here. And I should say, I'm quite excited about this topic because I'm kind of a 90s kid. And I remember in the early 90s, we'd be sitting there in elementary school, and we were being told that our future was going to be essentially Pax Americana, liberty, wealth, democracy. It was going to be Star Trek: The Next Generation without the warp drive. It was going to be fantastic, smooth, and quite honestly, very, very boring. And we were not really looking forward to it. And then, of course, things got much more exciting. By the time I was 18, 9/11 happened. Perhaps wasn't an era of re-civilization, but maybe re-barbarism that started then. And so I'm very glad to see that now we're discussing an era of re-civilization, or is it? And today, to talk about this topic, speaking to these issues of the 90s, of these ideas of the end of history, Fukuyama's idea from 89 or 93, depending which publication we're talking about, this idea that was pervasive in my youth, perhaps David's youth, perhaps Philip's childhood or infanthood. I'm not quite sure. I think he's younger than us. Those issues, I think that era, that Fukuyama era, is arguably one that's come to an end, has been disproved by reality, as all ideals or aspirations often are. So today, to talk about the era of re-civilization, what is it? What does it mean? Is it happening? Our two star speakers, both of whom are either former or current, or indeed I think both current Danube Fellows. So on the one hand, we have Philip Pilkington, current fellow here at the Danube Institute. He's great on Twitter, following there. He also works at MKI across the river, and he hosts the podcast Multipolarity, as recently reviewed by Jimmy Carr. We've also got Dr. David Dusenbury, who is a professor at the University of Florida, and he was a Danube Fellow and colleague here a couple of years ago, and indeed is back with us now for the time being. So, the structure today, I'm going to stop talking and hand it over to David, and he's promised he'll give a 10 to 15 minute talk, although obviously as an academic that could be 10 to 50 minutes, you're never really sure, but 10 to 15 minutes by David to introduce the topic. Then they will engage in a discussion for 45 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up to questions. And I know the University of Austin are well represented here. I did a seminar with them yesterday. They have a lot of questions, so we'll leave at least half an hour for that. All right, thank you very much, and take it away, guys. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Callum, and I'm going to take off my watch only to make sure it's closer to 10 than 50 minutes. It really is. It's always such a pleasure to come back to Budapest, especially this time of year, the crisp air, which is not often encountered in Florida, I must say. And it's especially nice to be back at the Danube Institute. I just want to point out that the article that Philip and I are going to be discussing, which just came out in American Affairs, the whole project we're kind of working on was launched here at the Danube Institute this summer. And so for that and other reasons, it's really nice to be in the house talking about the article. In the meantime, Philip and I have actually gone and given talks at a number of universities and institutions in both Beijing and Shanghai. So we now come to you with the benefit of some conversations with Chinese intellectuals. And, we're hoping to have some more essays forthcoming in the near future. There might even be a book before too long. So I just want to lay out in really just a few minutes what I take to be our basic premises, claims, intuitions. Philip is free to dispute these in our conversation afterwards, but I think, at least in my mind, these are the basic points that we're making and the assumptions that we're working from. The first, I think, is really not controversial. The world order is rapidly changing, and the post-1991 liberal hegemony is effectively dead. I think this is something that we can take to be a workable hypothesis, whether or not, or to whatever degree we might lament the passing of that era. So that's the first point. The second is slightly more controversial, I suppose, and it's just that the West has behaved recklessly and counterproductively in the decades since the end of the Cold War. I would really look, just very briefly, I would look positively to the first Iraq War. The first Iraq War, overseen by George H.W. Bush, was undertaken with the approval of the UN Security Council. There was a massive international coalition brought to bear. It was undertaken in order to redress a flagrant violation of international law. And most importantly, once the internationally sanctioned mission had been accomplished, George H.W. Bush withdrew forces. There were voices in the United States, broadly speaking neocon voices, which wanted him to press on to Baghdad. He refused, and I think that was, in a sense, the last really kind of disciplined undertaking that we've seen. So I think we behaved recklessly and counterproductively since the first Iraq War. This is due in large part to the fact that the West doesn't really know its own history very well, and it tends to disavow what little of its own history it does know. How the West's ignorance of history, its contempt for its own history, and the myth of the end of history, which Callum has just mentioned, intertwine with the kind of hubris that I've already alluded to, is something that Philip and I will be discussing further and thinking more about in future. The third claim or intuition is that a complex, arduous, decades or even centuries-long project we are calling re-civilization is necessary if the Western legacy, by which I mean its cultural legacy, political legacy, and religious legacy, is going to survive. I really think without what we're calling re-civilization, the West does not have a future. Now, the word itself is Thomas Carlyle's, the great 19th century British writer. He used it to describe the French Restoration after the Jacobins' reign of terror, and it seems apt to us to again talk about the task of re-civilization. I would only add that the word decivilization is kind of in the picture when you talk about re-civilization. The term decivilization was apparently coined by Renaud Camus, who was a somewhat spicy French writer, but it was actually the president of the French Republic, Emmanuel Macron, in, I believe, 2023, who kind of popularized the term decivilization. So I think Philip and I are both hoping that if we consistently ask, we in the West consistently ask the question, is this re-civilizing or decivilizing? I think this question can be both in domestic and regional, but also in global terms. I think it can be a highly illuminating question to ask. There is, in fact, I say this in passing, but there is a Chinese term which is endorsed by the Chinese state, which kind of chimes with re-civilization, called revival of civilization. Philip and I only learned this fact after launching the project, but it's, I think, suggestive, and we're happy to discuss that further. The fourth claim is that peace between the great powers, by which I mean the United States and China, this is less controversial in December of 2025 than it was in the summer of 2025, because a new national security strategy has just been published in Washington, D.C., and a different tone is being taken towards China. But I'm going to add another state here, which I realize this is going to be a bit distressing perhaps for some. But I would say peace between the great powers, the United States, China, and Russia, is essential if a Western program of re-civilization is to be viable. The de-civilizational forces, the entropic forces at work in the late liberal West are extremely strong. And I personally believe that if we allow ourselves to be drawn into any sort of great power conflict at this juncture, or in the case of the proxy war in Ukraine, if we allow ourselves to be drawn further into an escalatory conflict, I truly believe the West is finished, and I want to make this point really blunt. It seems to me, I could be wrong, and not all at the Danube Institute would agree with the point I'm making. But in my judgment, no one agitating for new, renewed, or further military commitments in a great power context at this juncture is really acting in the best interest of the West in the longue durée, whatever their motivations may be. Fifth and finally, the traditional Western attitudes. We're here primarily to speak about the West and China, and it might surprise you to learn that the traditional Western attitude towards China, going back half a millennium, is that of admiration for Chinese civilization, Chinese governance, in fact, and a desire to work in harmony with China. Much more could be said, of course, but here I just want to point out, I expect most of us will have heard of the century of humiliation. There's a great deal to be said about the century of humiliation, but I want to just briefly note that there's only one century of humiliation. The West and China have been dealing with each other for half a millennium, and it is really only one of these centuries that is so distinctly problematic. We could at least ask, have there been something like 3 or 4 centuries of mutual influence and at least greater respect, if not perfect respect, greater respect? And if the answer is yes, then it's at least worth asking whether we could hope for 3 or 4 more centuries of mutual influence and respect. I began just a few minutes ago by talking about how impoverished the West's public collective memory is, and to conclude my brief remarks and to prove this point in a way that I hope will be positive and even hopeful, let me make one point and then support it extremely briefly by showing you a couple of photographs, which should, I think, be familiar to all of us, but which I predict will not be familiar to many of us. The point is just this: the outcomes of both the Second World War and the Cold War depended on American collaboration with China. Let me restate this. It is an uncontroversial fact that should be salient in Western political discourse and in every Westerner's mind, but that I myself have never heard stated publicly by any politician, and really not any academic, that if the United States had not had China as an ally in both World War II and then the Cold War, then neither of the decisive conflicts of the last century would likely have been resolved in favor of the United States and, more broadly speaking, for lack of a better phrase, the collective West. Having made that claim, just look briefly with me at a few photos. Here we see the head of the Chinese nationalist forces, Chiang Kai-shek, the communist leader Mao Zedong, and the U.S. ambassador to China, Patrick Hurley, in the autumn of the last year of the Second World War. Hurley was quite an interesting character, and among other offices he held was that of U.S. Secretary of War in the 1930s. Those of you who hail from the United States will notice the terminology, Secretary of War. This is something that has recently returned, and Hurley was himself a Secretary of War. Here we see a meeting of the US, UK, France, USSR, and China as part of the delegates of 50 nations agreeing upon the Charter of the United Nations, San Francisco, California, in 1945 as well. And I just want to point out that it was precisely because China was an ally of the West and of the United States in World War II that it has a chair on the UN, a permanent chair on the UN Security Council to this day. So that role is enshrined institutionally, even if we do not do a very good job of remembering it politically or rhetorically. Here we see the great, to my mind, I realize this is a bit controversial, coup d'etat-ed President Richard Nixon in the People's Republic of China in 1972, looking very thoughtful. Of course, we don't know what Nixon was thinking as he looked out over the plains at the Great Wall. But whatever Nixon might have been thinking here, I suggest that this photo can take us all the way back to the very first Western book ever published in China, The title you see here by Father Matteo Ricci, the great learned Jesuit father, Maxims on Friendship for a Chinese Prince. And we see a quote which I think is really worth carrying forward. It's the epigraph of Phillips in my new article. With harmony, slight things grow to greatness. With discord, great things shrivel and fail. This was true for Ricci in the 1590s, true for Nixon, I would argue, in the 1970s, and still true for us today. The last thing I'll say is just that Matteo Ricci took these lines from a first century Roman historian, Sallust, who happens to have been St. Augustine's favorite historian. So it might seem a bit weak, a bit late modern, a bit strange to talk about harmony as a fundamental geopolitical principle. But I would say that if Ricci was content to take these lines in 1596 from a first century Roman, it might well prove to be a fine motto in the 21st century, if that is, we mean to re-civilize. So, thank you.
Thanks, David. It's okay. Thanks, David, for getting us started. I'm not sure if I'm a moderator or a participant here, but I'll try and play both roles. So I suppose we should probably start from the beginning of the essay. Maybe you'd like to tell people a little bit about Francis Fukuyama and his end of history thesis, assuming complete ignorance.
Oh, assuming complete ignorance. Okay, so then I should take my watch off again to make sure that we don't open the question time 50 minutes from now. Okay, so for those of you who were not around in 1989, right on the cusp of the end of the Cold War, not all of us might know that basically the end of the Cold War, the dating of the end of the Cold War is in fact disputed. So one can date it to 1989 or 1991. We'll kind of set that to one side. But let's just say in the midst, either on the cusp of the end of the Cold War or in the midst of the demise of the USSR, an American State Department analyst, Rand Corporation analyst, said, look, what's happening now is not just some sort of interesting phase in world history. It's what he called the end of history. Now, Francis Fukuyama might be many things, but he's not mad. He did not mean that time was ending. He did not mean that humans would not continue to disagree about things. He did not even mean that there would be no further war. What he meant was that a certain conception of human collective life, which he was more or less content to call liberal democracy, had proven itself satisfactorily in enough of the world's societies that all other of the world's societies would gradually be drawn to imitate the liberal democratic model. And he also thought that basically there was enough military, not only kind of political and psychological power behind liberal democracy, but there was enough military heft that the liberal democratic world no longer needed to fear great power conflict between itself, the liberal democratic West, or world rather, and illiberal great powers. This is over. And we can discuss more why that is. But to keep this really brief and simple, I mean, we begin by simply pointing out that whatever theoretical objections you might have to this picture, one of the things that cannot be disputed is that Fukuyama put this argument forward at a time when it matched very well the mood of the Western political class. And so it was thrilling to them to have, in a sense, this emotion, we call it euphoria, which is actually a term I got from a conversation with a rather distinguished British politician who was describing to me how he and his peers felt circa 1990. This euphoria seems to have kind of found its theoretical image borne out in Fukuyama. I mean, is that...
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's interesting, 2 points in that first of all, as you say, Fukuyama was primarily a government bureaucrat and not a philosopher. Now, he was a government bureaucrat with some understanding of philosophy. I don't think he was a leading philosopher or anything like that, but he had a reasonable grasp of the ideas that he was talking about, I think we could say. And the second point I think that you made that's worth stressing is that it captured a mood, yes, in that bureaucratic class, but as we show in the essay, and I think you're more responsible for this than me, in the academic world and in the philosophical world and the historical world, Fukuyama's thesis wasn't actually that popular, right?
No, and this is one of the ironies, is that basically the political efficacy of the end of history narrative seems to have far outstripped, in fact, its kind of intellectual persuasiveness. And even we point out at the end of the first section, we point out that kind of calling an end to the end of history has been something that various Westerners have been doing for at least a quarter of a century now. But at least, to my mind, Philip, the West has continued to sort of act under the spell of the idea of the kind of triumphant liberal democratic epoch, whatever criticisms might be leveled against the theory.
Yeah, and I mean, as you say, there's been a couple of calls of the end of history, and also a couple of calls for the end of history. So I think around the time of the Iraq War, some people said, "Oh, it's the end of history," and actually, what they were calling for was more aggressive liberal democratic intervention. But of course, I think what we're trying to say is there's something slightly different happening this time around.
Indeed. And okay, so not to complicate matters too much, but this summer when we began this project, I actually pointed out, we were reading an interesting article by Georgy Plekhanov, who is a Georgian. He's regarded as the first Russian Marxist, basically. He was a friend of Lenin's, although he ended up distancing himself from the Bolshevik Revolution. But the point is, Plekhanov points out, which I did not know, and I have yet to encounter it anywhere but in Plekhanov's essay, that a right Hegelian, a conservative Hegelian in the 1830s already called the end of history. I think it was 1838. So Fukuyama is definitely not the first to sort of claim that we have reached some sort of kind of moment of completion in global history, which allows no further contestation, meaningful contestation or progress. One of the ironies we try to bring out in the article, though, is that so if the first end of history was in the 1830s, pronounced by a right Hegelian, and then Fukuyama makes the same move in 1989, which we're discussing, there's another end of history declared in the middle of the 20th century by a figure named Alexander Kojève. We can say a lot more about him, but right now I'm just going to stress this point. The weird thing about Kojève talking about the end of history in the middle of the 20th century is that he was a hardcore Stalinist. He was a very ardent, committed Stalinist. He also had a hand in creating the European Union. That's kind of a different story. But I think we'll all see the curiousness, the intrigue, the counterintuitiveness of this triumphant moment circa 1990, and Fukuyama saying now this kind of Stalinist dream of the end of history can be brought forward in our favor and can kind of guide us in the coming decades.
And basically, I think we also argue in the essay that Fukuyama's become a little bit frayed since the Ukraine war, especially. That's really been the beginning of the end of history, right?
I think, we kind of argue this, Philip, that it's not so much the beginning of the end of history, because that's been underway for a while. But I think the Ukraine war is the point at which it becomes harder and harder to publicly deny that things are changing. Honestly, between you and me, I mean, we've talked about this. I was just in London the other day, and in certain parts of the collective West, it's still impossible for people to kind of face the changes which I think are underway. I understand that, and in a certain sort of way, I honor it. I mean, I'm happy to talk to whoever is happy to talk to me. But I do think the Ukraine war has kind of brought the gravity of the situation home at an institutional level.
Okay, so let's go back to the actual theory itself in a sense, because as we show in the paper, it's not just about 1989. In fact, the end of history doesn't even start 1945, not even at the establishment of the American empire, the American hegemonic world order. Fukuyama's actually going right back via Kojève to Napoleon, right?
Yes, so I mean, I know that some of you have already, I think some of you have already looked at this article, so forgive us if we're telling you things that you're already familiar with. But indeed, I mean, one of the things that Philip and I are interested in is the fact that Fukuyama's main source for this kind of end of history narrative is the fellow I was just talking about, this kind of Russian-French intellectual, Alexander Kojève, who, by the way, we don't actually go into this in the article. He had a massive influence on post-war intellectual history. Absolutely, everyone in France of intellectual significance in the middle of the 20th century attended Kojève's seminars. Jean-Paul Sartre, Jacques Lacan, and on, Georges Bataille, on and on and on. Many, many interesting people were present. And Kojève himself says, okay, okay, can I just say a few words about the Kojèvian concept of history?
I think we should be pretty thorough here.
Okay. The end of history, of necessity, refers us to a beginning. Only what has a beginning has an end, right? So let's at least take a moment to ask, what is the beginning of history according to Kojève, and why does that lead him to say the end occurs when the end occurs? So Kojève says, based on his reading of Hegel, that history begins very simply with a conflict in which there is only one victor. There are two parties, and there's only one victor. The victor becomes a master, and the other party who survives becomes a slave. So history begins, according to Kojève, with the master-slave relationship, and both of them ultimately, deeply, profoundly desire what he calls recognition. And for complicated reasons, this is not a philosophy lecture, so we're not going to go into it, but for complicated reasons, neither the master, we might think, oh, the master would be satisfied. The master is alive and the slave recognizes the master. It's actually more complicated than that. Kojève argues that neither the master nor the slave is ultimately given recognition, and that all of human history is a complicated outworking of different peoples within societies and different societies amongst themselves striving for recognition. That is the course of history. And then he says, okay, well, has there been a period in which universal recognition has become realized on Earth? And if you have a condition of universal recognition, then you can have a satisfaction of the desire that's driving history. Everyone wants to be recognized. And if everyone gets satisfied, gets recognition, then history is at an end. And for Kojève, yes, there has been such a point, and it was the French Revolution, and more specifically, because the French Revolution was actually a national movement, and it was a particular figure, Napoleon Bonaparte, who said, we're taking this thing abroad. We are internationalizing the rule of liberty, equality, and fraternity. And so Kojève says, this is it. Universal liberty, equality, and fraternity, that's universal recognition, and universal recognition is the end of history. So basically, what we have is French Revolution followed by Napoleon, the internationalization of the revolutionary order, and the end of history begins then with the person who's only been alluded to in passing, Hegel. Hegel was actually an inhabitant of one of the nations overrun by Napoleon. He actually saw Napoleon on horseback in a very, very famous letter, which is endlessly quoted, but somehow, even though it's endlessly quoted, it's always fascinating to read. And so Kojève says, look, we have two things going on. Napoleon internationalizes liberty, equality, and fraternity, and Hegel is there to theorize it. And once you have the realization and the theorization, basically, not only is history ended, but essentially philosophy is ended too, with Hegel.
Yeah, I think it's worth stressing something here for a moment. Obviously, Francis Fukuyama is kind of known as a neoconservative now, so he's very much in favor of these liberal interventions that are very unlike the First Iraq War, which is limited, an attempt to garner rule of law. But of course, Napoleon's the same. And so the conception that Fukuyama is drawing on is not the typical kind of negative liberty version of liberal democracy that we hear about. It's actually a sort of a violent liberal democracy, right?
Indeed, yeah. We kind of bring this out later in the article when we talk about some of the language Fukuyama uses to describe the triumph of the liberal democratic world is that, getting back to the beginning of history, it's that of the master, indeed. It's that of the uncontested victor who is thereafter capable of regarding any illiberal parties as basically vanquished. Yeah.
And should we perhaps talk a little bit about the fact that Kojève wasn't just a liberal democrat, he was at one point a Stalinist, right?
Yeah, so I just referred to the end of philosophy. I don't know if anyone has heard. A lot of people in the 20th century like to talk about the end of things. So, the death of the author, the end of history, the end of art, the end of poetry, and so on and so forth. And in a sense, we can say to his credit that Kojève took the end of philosophy rather seriously, by which I mean he published almost nothing that he wrote. He wrote huge amounts of really interesting literature. Interesting, of course, does not mean correct, but interesting literature. He has a 1,000-page philosophical treatise, which is still unpublished, for instance. And the point is this: one of the unpublished documents in the Kojève archives is a letter he composed to Joseph Stalin, basically putting himself forward as the court philosopher of the Stalinist regime. He wrote this curiously from Paris, not the most straightforward thing to do. And then he proceeded, as I've already mentioned, to become one of, he worked for the French government, and he was one of the guiding hands in the early gestational period of what became the European Union. He died of a heart attack during a meeting in 1968 in Brussels. And so he's a kind of martyr, one could say, to the to EU bureaucracy. And it's a bit weird, this is the last point I'm making, it's a bit weird that someone who not only wrote a letter to Stalin putting himself forward as the theorist of the Stalinist regime, but who joked to his friends to the end of his life that he was a Stalinist, would have had such a profound impact, not only on the institutional reality of the European Union, but as we're talking about, on the self-conception of the liberal world since the end of the Cold War.
So as you can probably tell now, the end of history thesis is a bit unusual, and it's far more unusual than people understand. A lot of the neoconservative movement is actually very unusual and very tied up with Marxism in general. But I suppose we'll leave that aside for now. If you're interested in it, please read the essay if you haven't. But of course then we're claiming that all this is coming to an end. And yes, of course, the Ukraine war is part of this, but our thesis basically is that China's the big part of it, right?
Indeed, yes. I mean, and I don't know where you want to go exactly with this, Philip. I mean, do we want to talk about economics? Because if we're talking about the rise of China economically, then you're actually in a far better position than I am to lay out some of the...
No, I think we can just stick with the cultural aspects that we do in the essay, right?
Okay, so yes, so maybe I'll come back. I mentioned that China has a term, a party-sanctioned term, which identifies a whole-of-government program, which kind of chimes with what we're calling re-civilization, although, as I've already said, and I want to really underscore, this CPC term had nothing to do with our desire to kind of use the word re-civilization. We started talking about that before we knew that there is a Chinese counterpart. Okay, so revival of civilization is one kind of concomitant of the rise of China since really beginning in the 1970s with the reopening that Nixon and Kissinger kind of initiated. But let's say that this rise, this economic rise, which has its political aspects as well, it has really become kind of most pronounced and most momentous in the 21st century. Is that fair? I mean, it's in the last couple of decades, 25 years. Okay. So, culturally speaking, it's in light of the kind of wealth and power of the People's Republic that the party under Xi Jinping has identified a need. And that need is for some sort of re-evaluation, re-embrace of what they call, this is also a formally endorsed term, fine traditional Chinese culture. Fine traditional Chinese culture. So the revival of civilization that they are undertaking is a reevaluation of their own traditional culture. Now, for those of you who weren't born in 1989, I'll just say something really briefly about the 1970s. Of course, there was a really quite extreme, I think it's fair to say, a rather ferocious period in Chinese history in the 1970s called the Cultural Revolution. And let's just say that everything old, there were actually 4 olds which were targeted. Everything old was by definition treated as suspect, hostile to the party, hostile to the state, inimical to the future of the Chinese nation, and so on and so forth. The CPC, the Communist Party of China, has not disavowed the Cultural Revolution, but what they have done is said, look, whatever phase this was is closed, it is concluded, and it is now in the interest of the Chinese nation, having been through the Cultural Revolution, to ask ourselves what needs to be carried forward of fine traditional Chinese culture, what needs to be revived. And I think, I mean, at least tell me if this sounds right to you, Philip, but I mean, one of the reasons that we find this an interesting move on the part of China is it seems to me that the West has been through a period of really radical cultural revolution. And I don't think there's any going back. One cannot simply disavow and jettison what has happened in the West. But I think there's a certain subtlety to the move that the CPC has made, which is saying, okay, that was a phase, certain things have changed, but nevertheless, this is now the time to reevaluate and to critically appraise that phase, and more importantly, to re-embrace what came before this phase. And that I think is more or less the aspect of the cultural moment in China that, or one of the aspects of the cultural moment in China that we're trying to both evaluate, report to the West, but also think about.
Well, yes, and also the political aspect to it. So Fukuyama's idea was that China would eventually, like everywhere else in the world, become a liberal democracy. And in fact, I think we quoted in the essay, he even says that if China continues to develop economically and doesn't become a liberal democracy, all these students that went to the United States, to universities in the United States, will come back and demand liberal democracy. And of course, that's not happening at the moment. What we're seeing is a redevelopment of a very normal form of Chinese government, right?
Indeed, and there's a really interesting footnote in Kojève's lectures on Hegel, which he originally gave in the 1930s. I think they were published in the 1940s, and then he continued to revise them. One curious note, I've already talked about kind of the strange fact that this Stalinist philosopher would become so important for the liberal West. There's also a kind of curious fact that Kojève's lectures were edited by a surrealist, Raymond Queneau. And so it's a strange brew of kind of influences and actors who kind of stand behind the myth of the end of history. But the point we're making here is that indeed the kind of the Chinese return to fine traditional Chinese culture is unexpected from the perspective that Fukuyama puts forward, which is that basically a certain kind of drift into consumerism, and from consumerism into liberal democracy is totally inevitable. And in the footnote I've already mentioned, Kojève was predicting exactly the same thing in the 1950s. He was saying, we have a problem. Russia and China are becoming richer, and as they become richer, there are, even though they're both communist states, he's speaking in the 1950s, the USSR and China are inevitably going to become more complacent and cut off from the kind of the sources of their traditional cultures. And what we have seen, not only in China, but indeed in Russia in recent years, is some sort of reappraisal of traditional culture and the kind of the reconstitution of both Russia and China as what certain Chinese intellectuals call civilization states. And yeah, so just to bring it back around, Philip, this is an unexpected result from the kind of optic that both Kojève and Fukuyama had. It's not supposed to go this way.
That's insofar as, just to be clear, it's not supposed to, other civilizations aren't supposed to emerge with non-liberal democratic structures, right?
Right, and having attained a certain measure of prosperity in the modern age, they're not supposed to sort of cling to, much less to advance their historical identities. Rather, they're supposed to sort of cede ground to the Western ethos and self-image.
Yeah, and I think we should focus a little bit more on the decivilization aspect, because you mentioned it with respect to the West. I think actually Kojève's thoughts on consumer culture and so on are a little bit deeper than Fukuyama's maybe, and maybe they speak to the process of decivilization we've seen in the past 2 generations or so.
Yeah, well, I mean, in a sense, Philip, at least to my mind, and we don't necessarily see entirely eye to eye on all of these questions, but for me, there's a lot that could be said about decivilization in the Western context. I personally think, since we're in Budapest, it's not a problem to say this, that historically unprecedented and largely uncontrolled levels of migration are definitely part of the picture. But in terms of Kojève's idea of decivilization, he was actually worried that that basically once the desire for recognition which drives history is satisfied, he was worried that basically it's this desire for recognition that creates societies and that ultimately makes us human, indeed. And that once this desire is satisfied, we could sort of subside into a state of decadence, or he actually uses the term animality, which a kind of straightforward term for what he's talking about as a return to animality would be decadence, that we'll become decadent. And so certainly, Philip, I think a kind of like a cycle of prosperity and decadence is not an extremely original idea. And I think, this is something that we'll all recognize in the West. But I'm not sure that fully captures the
well, I think the interesting point, one of the interesting points is that Kojève is quite cognizant of this potential for a descent into sort of nihilism, whereas Fukuyama seems to actually embrace it, and maybe that's the Europeanist tradition versus the American tradition. I'm not sure.
Okay, well, to be fair, there is one line of Fukuyama's 1989 article which I really like, and he says the end of history will be a very sad time. I think that's a good line. That's prophetic. And of course, as we're discussing, I mean, I think he ultimately takes this insight, this prediction from Kojève for the reasons I've just been trying to outline. But I think some of what's weird about, and a little hard to get to grips with Fukuyama, is that kind of, we've already alluded to the difference between the mood of euphoria and the theory of the end of history. And one sees something of this even in Fukuyama himself. Because I would want to argue, Philip, that Fukuyama, at least at certain parts of his writings, kind of recognizes that the end of history brings this danger of decadence and the sense of meaninglessness and so on and so forth. But nevertheless, as Philip has already mentioned, when you look at his public engagement with policy issues, he still seems to be operating on kind of the assumption of endless triumph rather than this kind of one would think that if Fukuyama is keenly aware of the danger of decadence and a return to animality, a certain kind of spiritual discipline and composure would be called for, and certain policies which reflect that would be encouraged, and that doesn't seem to be part of the Fukuyamian ethos.
Well, it cashes out. I mean, Fukuyama's kind of the highbrow version, and the lowbrow version is Thomas Friedman's idea that every country that has a McDonald's won't go to war with another country that has a McDonald's. I mean, that's the recognition problem put into New York Times speak in a sense. But I mean, I see a strong continuity between at least the vibe that Fukuyama is giving off and the hamburger international policy of Thomas Friedman, right?
Well, this is something you could say more about. Haven't you put forward a sort of? I think there was a multipolarity podcast on hamburger.
That's Malcolm Cheyenne's
on the distinguished sandwich. Yeah.
That is to do with domestic affairs. That's when a hamburger gets too expensive, you start to see social breakdown in certain Western countries. But no, I'm being kind of serious. Fukuyama put forward this vision, and it was popularized. And I think the real popularized version of it was Thomas Friedman's. And Thomas Friedman's, and as you say, the actions undertaken by the Fukuyamists seem to revel in decivilization, in a sense. Or would you disagree?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, do they revel in decivilizations? I really don't want to, I've lived, fortunately, all my years without reading a single article by Thomas Friedman. So, I intend to die without ever having read more than a headline by that particular gentleman. So I can't really speak to him specifically, but I guess, okay, so I guess there is probably some kind of deeper debated work within the liberal West, which we could kind of discuss further if there were interest in terms of kind of Hegel and Kojève and the history of modern Western philosophy, over whether basically civilization is simply a matter of satisfying human desires, or whether in fact satisfying all human desires leads to decivilization, and civilization has something essential to do with kind of harnessing and chastening and disciplining and controlling human desires. Like there are perhaps two radically different pictures of what it means to be civilized and what it means to kind of realize a more perfect civilization. And so I guess some of the sort of theorists of liberal democracy who more or less believe that more money means more strength and more satisfaction means more happiness would kind of, I would see that basic picture as decivilizing, even if the proponents would not say that they themselves might see this as a civilizing vision. And within certain limits, one might say it contains the elements of a civilizing vision, or certain elements of a civilizing vision. But nevertheless, I think when these kind of elements are absolutized, you end up with entropy.
Okay, so I guess we'll turn to the re-civilization element in the Western context. So I think we have a few things to say here, but maybe we'll start with the figure of Ricci and the Jesuits, who we have the quote from here, because Matteo Ricci, I think you mentioned a little bit in your introduction, was one of the really was the first sinologist in a sense. He was the first educated person to go from the West to the East and communicate back what was going on in the East, and doing that, he had an absolutely enormous impact on the way the West thinks about itself. So maybe you could start with how we've introduced Ricci into the conversation here.
Well, I mean, there really is an incredibly fascinating and complex and as yet imperfectly understood history of the Jesuits in the imperial court in Peking. And I'm by no means a specialist, so there's a lot I don't know. Before we even get to Ricci, I would just say there is actually a longer history of contact between ancient Rome and China, and medieval Christendom and China. Marco Polo is, of course, the one name that everyone knows, but there were other friars who made it as far as China in the 13th and 14th century. And I myself have read a really incredible text by a guy named William of Adam. This history deserves to be much better known. It's published by Harvard University Press, beautiful edition, came out about 10 years ago. It has the rather spicy title, "How to Defeat the Saracens." So it's a crusading manual. But it's really important because do we all know why Christopher Columbus ended up sailing west? He sailed west in hopes of finding a new route to, it was a crusading venture. And before Columbus made his crusading venture, Dominican friars like William of Adam were traveling very extensively. And Adam has this is in the 1320s, he has firsthand knowledge of the islands off of India, the inner markets in Persia. It's really quite extraordinary. And he had a very elaborate plan for kind of settling the question of the control of Jerusalem. Anyway, okay, but the point is this. In the late 16th century, the Jesuits set up shop in China, and one can still, I don't think either of us have had the honor yet of visiting Ricci's grave, but Ricci's grave can still be visited in Beijing today. There is he holds an honored place in the capital.
This is due to the fact he introduced Western science to China. So even the fact that he's a Catholic missionary and that aspect of his legacy currently in China is not dead, but it's questioned or questionable. He still is known for introducing, geometry and all these Western scientific aspects. So he's still much beloved in China today for this reason.
Yeah. So there was the Jesuits were extremely valued in the imperial court for I don't have the exact dates, but let's say for at least a century, and they were often court astronomers. They taught music theory and architecture and certain forms of casting canon. So
that was very popular.
That was very popular. And okay, so this is interesting. This is really fascinating. This is not very well known. The Treaty of Nerchinsk in the late 17th century was the first, so recently, as I'm sure all of you are aware, through what I would regard as not the best Western strategy, China and Russia have forged one of the closest alliances they've had in a number of decades, let's say. Okay? They have a very, very close working relationship. And the very first time that China and Russia created a treaty was in the late 17th century, the Treaty of Nerchinsk, which was actually written by Jesuits at the imperial court in Peking in Latin. So the first international treaty in a modern sense that China ever created was composed in Latin by Jesuits at the court. And it was the first time that China deigned to recognize, I think they were actually called the White Lords of Russia. But the point is, in this treaty, China, which regards itself as, of course, it's a celestial kingdom, right? It has divine legitimacy. And it is the middle kingdom. It is the center, by traditional conception, it is the central kingdom on earth. But China deigned, under the influence of the Jesuits, in light of kind of Roman law and this conception that there can be more than one legitimate power on earth, and these nations can actually deal with each other on the basis of mutual respect. This is, the legacy of Roman law. However, one might want to, talk about Roman imperial history. That's a different matter. But it was on the basis of this Jesuit influence that the Chinese said, okay, there are other powers on earth, and we can recognize them as having distinct legitimacy. And the first such power that was ever recognized was Russia. Okay, but the point is this, yes, Philip, that there's a really long and rich history. All of this stuff, by the way, the Treaty of Nerchinsk, you should have been taught this in high school. I should have been taught this in high school. We should know about William of Adam and European friars writing in Latin in Persia in the 1320s. We're not taught this stuff, but this is very important, I think, in the early 21st century. And I guess what we're trying to do in kind of the broader project is remind both sides of some of the not only positive, but really quite profound ways in which these encounters have affected the way China thinks of itself as a modern nation and the way the West sees itself. What we have here is not only a quote from Matteo Ricci in 1596, but we have a lovely 18th century image of two British ladies dressed as Chinese ladies in a Chinese setting. And there's a massive collection of art called chinoiserie, which by means of which Europeans for centuries placed themselves in an Asiatic context and saw themselves as civilized precisely because they were kind of aware of this other world. And we're trying to raise awareness, to use a good Maoist term. We're trying to raise awareness of this history.
No struggle sessions, though, hopefully.
We're not into struggle sessions.
Okay, well, to pinpoint on that then, because we're running out of time before questions. You've already said that China went through a big revolution, first its actual revolution, then the Cultural Revolution. The West has recently gone through a revolution. So maybe you could say something about what we think we can learn from China in terms of the re-civilization dynamics.
So, I mean, in a sense, I think I've already stated my main point, which is that I think there's something both sophisticated and quite realistic about the party's determination that the period of cultural revolution cannot be erased, it cannot be simply condemned, and it can't be straightforwardly reversed. Like, it is a period of massive social change which simply has to be dealt with in a kind of mature and ongoing way. And nevertheless, without completely disavowing that period, the party is determined that the animus that drove that period has to be, in fact, rejected. I mean, the revival of civilization is a revival of precisely the elements which were targeted for destruction during the Cultural Revolution. And I guess it just seems to me from a Western perspective that, we all, I'm sure, are familiar with the return motif, with the Latin V, right? And I think kind of straightforward, simple return is just not a realistic policy. I think that there always has to be a recognition that we're beginning in a position which has been conditioned by whatever comes before. And if part of what comes before our current condition in the West is arguably decades or even centuries of radical cultural revolution, we have to acknowledge the reality of that period and the realities that period has created. And so I guess the inspiration I personally would take is that the revival of civilization on the Chinese model is not a straightforward return. It's actually very future-oriented. It's saying we are marching forward, and as we march forward, we're committed to revaluing even the elements of our tradition which this period of cultural revolution denounced and put in question. And I think that that's something that the Westerners can do themselves.
But of course, we have to stress here that China has a Confucian civilization, and the West presumably isn't going to become Confucian. We're talking about re-civilization to the going back to our tradition that isn't quite as old as China's tradition, but it's still, some would say 2,000. I think you say 3,000 sometimes years old.
Yeah, I would gun for 3,000 years. I mean, this is not, a rigorous argument, but we do point out in the article. I don't know if everyone has read. Probably all the University of Austin students have read Ozymandias by Percy Shelley, and that poem is about an identifiable pharaoh, Ramses II, who arguably, perhaps, was the pharaoh that had his face-off with Moses. And, roughly 1700 BC. And I think Shelley, writes a very powerful romantic poem about roughly 2,000 years before the birth of Christ. So I think we've got 3,000 or 4,000 years to work with.
We do questions?
Like an auction, I'll stand up here and find the questions. Actually, I'll start with one of my own. David and I met a few years ago. We joined the Danube Institute at the same time as fellows. And the opening thing where we got to know each other, David did a series of 6 lectures on a Czech philosopher of history called Jan Patočka. And Patočka is quite interesting because and David will correct me on this, from my understanding of Patočka, is he said there was that history is really the point where we become reflexive. We start asking, why are we doing what we do? Prior to that, in prehistory, people lived by tradition, by ritual, by myth, but they didn't have a reflexive component asking, what is it to be? Why are we? And at the moment where we start having that, you have the explosion of the axial age, you have the appearance of history. Patočka says that in modernity, I think that we're starting to lose the sense of meaning. And he argues that the entire concept of Europe is not just a place. It's like an effort to understand the soul, in a sense, and that's the history of Europe. It's a spiritual project, in a sense. Anyway, I was thinking about this when you talk about Fukuyama, because obviously Patočka was, as a philosopher of history, implied that there was a sort of collapse of this idea of history as being about the explorations of the soul, this reflexive asking of why are we, and of course. It seems like today we live in a world which is all about impulse. There's very little real seeking of truth, it seems. Everyone's just seeking vanity and attention. So Patočka seems to be, I think his critique of the pre-history period and the post-history period seems to be quite valid. But of course, Fukuyama himself is saying the end of history. And obviously, I think you're arguing against that concept as the end of history. So I'm wondering, David, how you square Patočka's view, of which I think you're quite a big fan, with the critique of Fukuyama, because both of them speak about history. They both talk about the end of history, but one I think you accept and one I think you may reject. I'll just start with that.
So that's a great, both a great summation of Patočka.
Well, I did listen to your 6 lectures, so very closely. Yeah.
But also a great question. So on the one hand, I don't think Patočka does talk about the end of Europe. And he talks about Europe after Europe, and we might, those of us who are not from Europe but nevertheless care deeply about Europe and about the West, might want to think about the West after the West. But I do think it's somewhat different from the end of history concept. But one thing that you bring up, Callum, which I find really valuable, and I'll just say a little bit about. So at the same time that Kojève was a radical atheist materialist, he was influenced by Christian philosophy. He wrote his PhD on a Russian philosopher named Solovyov, who is a major Christian intellectual of the 20th century. But he was a radical atheist, and right about the same time that Kojève is giving his atheist reading of Hegel in Paris in these lectures in the 1930s. By the way, whether Hegel was an atheist philosopher is a huge question, and Philip and I have kind of challenged that to some extent in our essay. This.
No, I think we agree he's a deist.
Well, I would call him a Christian.
Okay.
But anyway. Okay.
No, but the question isn't of atheism. Just.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, the question of Hegel's religious commitments and theistic commitments is a huge one. This is the point I'm making, which is relevant to Callum's question. Right about the same time Kojève is giving his lectures, which are so important for the West, a philosopher named Edmund Husserl, who taught Patočka, was giving lectures in Prague and Vienna called The Crisis of the European Sciences. And Husserl, who was Jewish, and he had already been expelled from his university by Martin Heidegger, his disciple. It's a really ugly story, but the point is this: in the mid-1930s, on the cusp of the Second World War, Husserl was appealing in very moving terms, in very intellectually rigorous terms, to what he called the crisis in European spiritual life. This is the term Husserl was using. And he says there's something wrong in our spiritual life, and he talks a lot about the infinite tasks that our spiritual life calls us to. Now, is there an end to an infinite task? No. If history is not just about social relations and recognition, if history, as Callum was saying, is a spiritual history, and if part of living in history is seeking truth, which is something we never entirely possess, or seeking God, or seeking justice, if part of living in history is actually engaging in infinite tasks, then there's no end of history whatsoever. And so I would actually, this is kind of a separate project, but in the long run, I would like to argue that basically we need to go back to Husserl in the we focused on the wrong set of lectures from the 1930s. We shouldn't be so keen on Kojève. We should probably be keener on Husserl and Patočka.
Thanks, David. We've got about 60 people here, so hopefully we'll have a number of questions. We've got about 25 minutes. Any questions? Patrick.
So first, thank you for this. Very, very interesting to hear. Thank you, gentlemen, both for this article and for this talk. It's very interesting. I'm broadly sympathetic to the project you're describing of a recovery or revival of civilization. I'm here from the University of Austin. You're here from the Hamilton Center in Florida. Hungary itself, I think, is engaged in similar projects, almost like the opposite of the Cultural Revolution, or at least transcending it, thinking about how can we can recover these things and apply them to the future. The question I would ask. One way to think about it is, how do you position yourselves vis-a-vis Huntington's concept of the clash of civilizations? Another way would be to think about it in terms of what you called two radically different visions of what civilization is. And to put it in a pointed way, I think for the kind of politician who is in favor of mass migration, for the kind of intellectual who is in favor of getting rid of old books, their way of thinking is that particular national civilizations are dangerous because they lead to war. So they would say to invest in reviving traditional Chinese civilization or Muslim civilization or Western civilization is to build up a kind of provocation, or that will lead to a clash. And instead, the way to ensure a certain kind of peace or pleasant decadence, as you were saying, is precisely to eviscerate and undermine and gradually dissolve all these kinds of cultural differences. So, my question for you is, how would you respond to that kind of criticism, that the way to peace is to dissolve precisely what you are proposing to revive and rebuild?
Can we add one more question to it? Do you want to take that one on its own?
No, I think go one at a time.
That's fine. Okay. Sure.
I'll leave the deeper answer to David, but I just highlight, in the world we currently live in, it's becoming increasingly clear that you can have a form of war liberalism that's very nihilistic and very negative liberty-oriented, progressive, et cetera, and very intent on conflict. I think anyone who reads a newspaper today can see that. The European Union is a perfect embodiment of that at the moment. So that will be my shallow answer. Maybe you can say something deeper.
No, and I just saw an article yesterday. It might have been The Atlantic or FT, which was kind of criticizing the rise in conservative pacifism, which it found deeply distressing that conservatives in the early 21st century are not committed enough to war. So I do think there's been a kind of very curious reversal in recent years in terms of the kind of right-wing axis and questions of war and peace, but that's kind of off to one side. I think, these are really great and deep questions, Patrick, and I'm not sure exactly how best to come at it. But I think on the one hand, I guess one thing I would say is that kind of setting aside the war culture of militant liberalism that we've already referred to.
Which neoconservatism was as well, let's be honest. It was Trotskyism dressed up as conservatism, so just, it's revolutionary ideologies that usually actually lead to war.
So, that point being made, I guess I would also underscore that war between nations is not the only kind of war. And civil war, internecine conflict is, of course, in a sense, according to Thomas Hobbes, this is the original war. What is the state of nature? What is the state of man before the sovereign emerges? It's war of all against all. And so I think, I guess I would want to argue that this has to be taken with deadly seriousness as well. So as someone who is seeking harmony between states and between blocks and between civilizations, I would also say to an intellectual like that, are we creating conditions for war within our territory as we seek to avoid conditions of war between states?
And just really quickly on the Huntington thing, I think we're increasingly seeing that Huntington is an example of somebody whose own civilization is effectively falling apart, and his response to that is to look for enemies abroad, in a sense, to look for other civilizations that are threatening you. Well, why are you threatened by them? Because they're building armies on your border? Or is it because they look more robust than you? With Huntington, it feels like he looks outside and he goes, oh no, robust civilizations, we'll have to have a fight, rather than resolve the internal contradictions. But of course, that's a classic truism, isn't it? That when your internal society is in trouble, leadership sometimes engages in war to look outwards.
Can I add one further point? And this really is interesting, that at this particular juncture in history, I think this is an empirical datum. Make of it what you will theoretically. But outside of the West, I think Philip will chime with me on this, maybe Callum can also confirm, but certainly in Beijing, they, in a sense, they want the West to be stable. They do not want civil war in the West. They do not want war with the West. They want the West to thrive and prosper and get itself together. And I think you even see some of that in some of the more stable monarchies in the Muslim world. I think you see this at least in certain circles in Russia and other places as well. So at this particular point in time, I mean, war between civilizations, clash of civilizations is definitely a major factor in the history of humankind, and I'm not dismissing that. But I think strangely enough, at this particular juncture in history, some other thriving, strong civilizations actually kind of want us to re-civilize, and they would be happy to see us make some moves in that direction.
Yeah, that's the impression we got from going to China. The Chinese are terrified at how unstable the West is becoming. That's their main fear in the world. Like, outside of nothing else, their main fear is the West looks really unstable politically and culturally. That scares us because it's unpredictable.
Okay, Luke, I think, had a question. Yeah, it's at the front row here.
Yeah, so I read your article. In your concluding section, one of the paragraphs, you end by saying, in a society focused on re-civilization, when talking about social media as an example, you say, Vice apps would be highly regulated or simply replaced by socially valuable systems. Now, at UATX, in our class here, we've talked a lot about like what the West is, what are our values, what is liberalism, kind of have two intertwined questions. In this context, who decides what's socially valuable for the West, how we're returning to Western values? And secondly, how would you personally define what a return to ancient Western roots actually looks like?
I'll speak to the status question. You can talk to the cultural one. The state always determines what is culturally promoted and what isn't. It was the case in America for a very long time. America, I always note to Americans, has very strict gambling laws, much stricter than than Europe, and there's a reason for that, because if you loosen the gambling laws, the nature of commercial activity in America means that gambling gets out of control, which I think you're about to see again with apps. So I think it'll just be a pragmatic response, really. I mean, I think there's a lot of talk in conservative circles now about these gambling apps. I think in good American tradition, gambling will get completely out of control with these apps, and then they'll have to re-regulate it. So I wouldn't care to make any big grand pronouncements about it. I'd say it'll be pragmatically approached. But these technologies are, very strong psychological motivators. And if you give that technology over to the commercial sector, they will exploit people. And we'll see that, and we'll see a response. But I don't even think there's any point in discussing what the blueprint for that will look like. I just guarantee it'll happen.
In the second row, the gentleman. Oh, wait, sorry. And who's the... who's got the next question? The second row here. There we go.
Go ahead.
Could I just say briefly in reply to your second question? I mean, one of the remarkable things. It's not. I won't say it's unique, but I would say it's in some ways, in some certain respects, singular about Western civilization, the civilization to which we're heir, is. It is not only immensely complex, because I think all great civilizations are immensely complex, but its sources are, in certain ways, quite distinct and highly differentiated, and so part of the text we actually cited at the end of our article is titled "Eccentric Culture" by Rémi Brague, who's a great French intellectual. There is something kind of, by eccentric he means literally, the deepest sources of the West lie outside the West. So even Greece, of course, we tend to associate Greece with the West, and I am fine with that. I love Greece, and it is part of Europe. But at the same time, it's at the furthest edge of Europe, and it actually belongs much more historically to the Mediterranean Levantine world than it does to Britain. Plato did not go north when he was trying to find interesting interlocutors. He went to Egypt. And Alexandria on the north coast of Egypt has been a much more important factor in the history of Greek intellectual history than Paris or Oxford. Okay, the point is this. That the Western civilizational picture is incredibly rich and incredibly broad and complex, and I think one can identify diverging strands within it, all of which can be carried forward into a very distant future with like honor and integrity and rigor. But we do so. Re-civilizing does not mean committing yourself to one particular element of the civilization. What I would say is re-civilizing does mean repudiating the 20th century narrative, which is not only 20th century, but repudiating the 20th century narrative that the West is basically nothing but a preparation for the horrors of genocide in the Second World War. The Western tradition is somehow uniquely culpable for the horrors of slavery. Nothing could be further from the truth. Like, it's a historically preposterous argument to be made, and yet somehow it's totally dominant in the United States and the West. And so basically we have to honor, I think, the Western civilization in all of its richness. And of course, honoring does not mean uncritically endorsing, but it does mean recognizing the greatness of what has come before and determining to carry it forward, even if one adopts a kind of minority stream within the tradition.
And I just really quickly add to that, one of the next planks of the project is to compare the deep civilizational roots of China and the West, because they have a lot in common. Most civilizations have a lot in common. Natural law, basic natural law principles, I think, are embedded in all civilizations, and that's what Ricci was actually arguing. He argued that there was a great deal of commonality between the West and the East, not because of cross-fertilization, just because there's something inherent in people that makes them build these cultural systems in a certain way. They're never identical. They're often quite different, but they're not as different as we often think.
Thanks, guys. Second row.
Yes, thank you very much, David and Philip. It's been a fascinating conversation, and I want to build upon the questions that have been very valuable questions and answers so far. But as probably the only Australian in the room, I want to urge that we take some care about generalisations, perhaps. Certainly my experiences, I think you know, David, I was here in Budapest in 1991 at the end of the era and the beginning of a new era. And the reason why each country sends its own diplomats to countries is so that we don't just read the dominant theory of the time from The Economist or from the New York Times, but so that each nation looks at what's going on. My experience as a young diplomat in those days here in Hungary was that the collapse of the Soviet Union had little to do with US triumphalism, but was actually more about the internal collapse of the Soviet Union itself. And I observed then the emergence of a European idea, a liberal idea, that Europe, if it was going to integrate the countries of Eastern and Central Europe, would need to develop some sort of philosophical basis for what it stood for. And I tend to agree with you that this went a little bit too far, as all things do in history, and everything corrects. So it seems to me that we had a period where the United States was convinced it was triumphal and had won some huge history-ending battle. Europe became entirely internally focused on building an ideological project for the first time, because I think the European Economic Community was not an ideological project, but the European Union became one. So, however, as an Aussie, I was sitting here, my government and my Foreign Affairs and Trade Department was entirely focused on building integration, architecture for international cooperation in Asia, working with China, with Japan, with Korea, with Indonesia, with other countries of the region. That was not an ideological project, and it remains decades later, even though it has been captured from time to time by some ideologues, but that hasn't lasted. What has lasted is the pragmatic inter-civilizational contact, cooperation, you might call it harmony, although I think that's again a bit too exaggerated perhaps, because it's never perfect. But my question is, if we can step back from the generalisations, my question is, what is this crisis in the West that you're talking about? Because I'm coming from a country that is economically doing very well out of its relationships with Asia. Culturally, we are stronger than ever and more integrated as a very harmonious, high immigration, multicultural country. We are a very successful society. We look at the United States and we worry about the state of the United States. We read that there's this polarization. We look at Europe and we worry about a lack of confidence and an economic stagnation. But is that really the end of the West? I think if we look to the countries that are less ideological, that are not engaged in these embattled fights between far right and far left, if we look at the moderate governments in actually many countries across the West, we're not in crisis, are we? Are we really in crisis? And what is the crisis?
Well, could you list some of these nations which have moderate governments and are not in a state of crisis? I'm curious.
New Zealand, Canada.
New Zealand is in your part of the world, so it's it has. I mean, Canada. Would we have? You're talking to some Canadians about.
Canada is not stable at the moment. There's an independence movement emerging in Alberta.
Well, the independence movement's been, as a part Canadian, the independence movement's been there for quite a while, but Canada is not.
No, but it seems to be growing now.
Yeah,
and
growing
it's
now.
a serious concern to the government.
Canada's got issues, for sure.
I think we all have issues, but my question is just, can we be precise about just what this crisis is? Because it seems to me there is a crisis of ideological extremes fighting each other, but somewhere in the middle, shouldn't we be trying to find some pragmatic way just to find a way forward here? Because it seems to me, as an outsider, admittedly, from the other side of the world, but when I come to Europe, I see a great civilization that's very resilient, has survived the excesses of the 1930s and 40s, the disastrous decivilization then, but it's rebuilt. It has fights and it has arguments, but we all do. We have arguments in our parliaments. No one's killing each other.
Can I just add something? Yeah, as a devil's advocate, I mean, I have discovered myself in conservative circles, there is a potential, this is just as a challenge to you, of a slightly sort of a feedback loop of everyone saying, like, everyone says London is terrible, but when I go to London, London's actually not that bad. And it's, to be honest with you, in my experience from there, just visiting. So I'm wondering, to what extent is there a risk that there is a sort of a feedback loop of a community telling themselves everything's in crisis, and in fact, beyond the bubble, it's not?
Well, I mean, as far as London is concerned, I mean, I was there just a couple of days ago. It's pretty dire, in my opinion. I first went to London in 1994, and I was telling Philip, I mean, I've lived there a number of times. I've lived in a number of different neighborhoods. I love London, and it's been part of my life since I was a teenager. And for the first time this week, I thought I might never return to London. I mean, it's feeling very ragged and very rough and very shabby, quite frankly. Anyway, so London is one thing, but I mean, I think when you look at the EU level, David, I mean, I think institutionally Europe is in a state of radical crisis. And I don't think this is really contestable. I mean, there's a massive showdown as we speak between the government of Belgium and the international, the Union of States, which is more or less housed in the state of Belgium. And over questions of like continent-shaping legality and indeed questions of war and peace. So I think if all you look at is the conflict between the government of Bart de Wever, who has the backing of Euroclear, and I personally think has the best interests of his state at heart, and the European Commission, I mean, I think it's really, I think there are plenty of people across the spectrum who recognize that we have institutions in crisis. So I personally don't see that as in any way controversial. And in terms of like the discourse of crisis, I mean, you know, I personally would argue that the state of crisis that we see unfolding now has been in the making for quite a long time, and it's not ultimately a partisan question, right? I mean, I think certain policies put in place by one party or another in one country or another might accelerate or decelerate the processes. But I do think that there is this deep identity crisis in the West, which is not, it's simply not present in the same way in China and in some of the other states, Russia. But if I may just very briefly come back to the very beginning, you talked about 1991, and I do think that part of the structural crisis of the EU in 2025 has to do with what Milan Kundera called in the 1980s the tragedy of Central Europe. And I personally would argue that part of the structural crisis in the EU goes back to the fact that the West, so let's leave Fukuyama and the United States out of it for a moment. Western Europe misunderstood the end of the Cold War. Because the end of the Cold War for Eastern Europe and the Baltics was about preserving nations and reasserting their existence in history, their political viability, their political subjectivity, and their future. It was not about, you know, eliminating all nations in the cause of peace, and this was how Western Europe, in fact, interpreted it. And so I think the crisis has been present since the 1980s in that respect.
I'd just add that this kind of, the narrative that we need to put aside the extremes and return to normal, it's been 10 years of this now. And we had a president that, you know, said it in Biden. It didn't work. Like, we can keep repeating these old liberal incantations, but they're not working. They're just not working. And so we're proposing something else that maybe, as you say, this is a form of identity crisis in the West. And what the West needs to do is, not to sound like a hippie, but find itself, right?
I think we're actually out of time. It's hit 11:30. Do you mind if I wrap it up, David? Is that okay with you? Yeah? Okay, well, thank you very much to everyone for coming. I think it's been fascinating, but particularly thank you to the guys. Thank you very much for this fascinating discussion, exchange, and lecture before that. Thank you. As I have a captured audience, though, for a second, I just want to say, particularly to all the Austin kids who must know how the internet works, the Danube Institute has a Substack called Based in Budapest, based in both senses. We are based here, and we're pretty based. So please sign up for our Substack. It comes out every Monday with updates on what's happening in town. It's written chiefly by Gavin Haynes and Peter Cadell. I must say it's very funny, so it's not your average newsletter. Please sign up for it. Based in Budapest. For anyone who is above the age of like 25, Substack is like a newsletter platform. You can sign up with email. And also the Danube Institute, we obviously run a lot of events. I think this is our last one of the year, but you can find us online. Indeed, if all technology goes right, this lecture will be online. And we have a YouTube channel. We have a very active Twitter and Instagram account. We have podcasts on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts, like and subscribe, etc. And but of course, we run events here in person. And come the new year, 2026, you're all welcome back. So this has been the Danube Institute. Thank you very much.